Pascal, you add something to what Christian said?
Yeah, I wanted to talk about the fact that what is the role of postmodernism. You talk about
Hmm.
that a decent amount in the paper, but how trends in academia that come out of the collapse of the new left and its retreat into academia result in this new development of the new kind of Foucauldian thinking that ends up helping facilitate this type of woke ideology that takes away from concentrating on structures as the means of oppression and focuses on the individual, things like post-colonialism, post-structuralism, and how all of that comes together to facilitate this thinking.
Yeah, well, um, I mean, it's part and parcel of this story of like, red baiting, anti-communism, and then filling in the vacuum with alternative radicalisms. And so after a, a generation or more of solid red baiting in all sorts of institutions, labor unions, public schools, government bureaucracies, and academia, um, there arrives in the early 70s, and I suppose even late 60s, it's beginning that this new kind of radical politics, particularly from France, Michel Foucault being the kind of exemplar of this. And I mean, Foucault is a member of the Communist Party, and then he leaves the Communist Party, and he has some pretty valuable and legitimate criticisms of the way that Western metaphysics in creating these truth claims empowers repression by states, medical bureaucracies, on and on. And Foucault felt this personally because, Foucault was gay. And, through most of his adult life, that was considered a mental illness. And people could be subjected against their will to like barbaric and horrible forms of essentially incarceration and forced treatment for that, right? So it's not like he's like doesn't have a point. He does have a point, but he's increasingly concerned with questions other than class exploitation, questions other than how capitalism functions, and he's not doing this from like a place of like never having read Marx. He has, right? And that's taken up in the U.S. Academy with alacrity because it allows a certain type of person to have it both ways. You can be against oppression. You can acknowledge many of the real injustices of the society that you live in, and you can propose changes and solutions that are, other than the redistribution of wealth. Might not even like get into that. You say, yeah, I mean, generally the way I learned Foucault was from people who were like, oh yes, of course, yes. The redistribution of wealth is important, but let's get on to like, ways of having the subaltern speak and, recalibrating power dynamics in our everyday discourse, right? And give it enough time, like that became the main focus. And that wasn't like in addition to how to redistribute wealth. And the great irony of the universalist class politics based on the redistribution of wealth is that many of the interests and needs and concerns of subsets of the working class that woke politics seeks to champion are in fact better served by universalist class politics. So take, for example, I think the example I use in the article is like Black trans people, right? If Black trans people are disproportionately oppressed as they are, and when you look into like the literature, you go, well, how are they most? What's the spread? Also, housing, jobs, all these kinds of things, medical access, right? The basic economic stuff. How are they going to get what they need? By organizing as Black trans people? I mean, you're talking now about a pretty small subset of the U.S. population. African Americans are 14% of the total population. I don't know what percentage of the total U.S. population are African American and trans. It's not a lot. The great irony is that if everybody came together to demand universal amelioration of these problems, universal redistribution, who benefits disproportionately? Ironically, those who are most oppressed, right? And so part of the the bait and switch of woke politics is to make these legitimate cases about like, oh, look who's most oppressed. Shouldn't we hold them up first? It's like, okay, you have a moral point there perhaps, but you know what? It's not going to work, right? What works historically are universalist demands. One, because you need everybody to come together to put enough pressure on the elites to get redistribution. And also because once those kinds of victories and reforms are achieved, they're ironclad or closer to ironclad when they're universalist. The means tested, implicitly racialized social welfare programs that come out of the war on poverty are fundamentally dismantled by the Clinton administration in the 90s, right? Why? In part because they don't serve everybody, right? So lots of people are like, yeah, forget it. It's not for me. Forget it. But Social Security, Medicare, Medicare and Social Security, these are universal programs, and they are really quite ironclad. And Roosevelt knew that at the time, and he insisted that Social Security not be means tested. And he said explicitly, if everybody pays into this and everybody gets something back from it, then they can't do anything to my Social Security program. And that's absolutely the case. They are chipping away at it with this like crypto privatization has been, since the George Bush administration, has been growing at about 5% a year under all these administrations, Republican or Democrat, with this like confusing, basically long story short, they're just bringing in private providers to manage the flow of resources that come from Medicare to the population, and they introduce names of these firms. You have to choose a private plan. It's very corrosive, and it introduces bureaucracy, and it's about undermining the legitimacy of these programs. So of course they can privatize it because Wall Street wants that money. They don't get fees on all this stuff. They want all that money dumped into the markets so they can fuck around with it and get their fees.